Hello and welcome to the Arab Digest podcast. I'm William Law, editor of the Digest newsletter, and my guest today is Maged Mandour. Maged is an economic and political analyst, and I'm pleased to say a regular contributor to the Arab Digest newsletter. He's the author of Egypt under El-Sisi, published by IB Tauris, which examines social, economic, and political developments since the coup of 2013. It's a book I highly recommend. Maged, great to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you, Bill. Happy to be back as always.
Now, Maged, I want to ask you, first of all, about the peace deal with Iran that Trump is poised to announce. 95% there, he says. He's just issued this Truth Social calling on these various Muslim countries to join the Abraham Accords. What are your thoughts on what's going on in Donald Trump's mind?
Well, it's very hard to tell actually what is real and what is fake here, and I will kind of see it when I believe it. But it's very clear that all of this is ad hoc in a way, and he's under tremendous pressure from the war hawks, from the Zionist lobby inside the US to try to present it as a comprehensive peace deal, as a regional transformation. Of course, that is detached from reality because I cannot imagine a scenario where, for example, the Saudis would actually sign on, considering how the US basically and the Israelis dragged them into a war that they did not want, that is really hurting them. So it's very hard to imagine that a comprehensive deal like this would actually work outside of domestic consumption purposes. I cannot imagine this moving forward, but it is actually highlighting something that we've been seeing over the past few years, and it's not just limited to Trump, is that how the United States is actually behaving like a revisionist power. It is effectively working in a way to transform the region outside of the architecture that it built itself, in a way that is clearly placing Israeli goals, security, strategy on top of the goals of the different allies, sometimes to America's own detriment in a way that might seem irrational. But the United States is definitely behaving in a way that one would expect a rising power to behave, rather than an actually existing hegemon, which is actually quite interesting. And it's reflecting broadly across the region in Egypt, Lebanon, the Gulf, of course, in the Iran war. But I do not see a feasible way to have a comprehensive deal like that without real radical transformation in the way that the Palestinians are actually being treated, like the whole comprehensive peace normalization. We just have to remember that there is the Arab Peace Initiative from, I believe, 2002,
Yes.
which was actually offering full normalization in return to a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders. So
Yep.
this is an official Arab position for over 20 years that is somehow sidelined under this idea of those Abraham Accords that would completely sideline the Palestinians, which has proven to be a foolish policy, but it seems that this understanding isn't really seeping in.
Yeah, you know what?
Um,
Yeah, for me, Maged, too, the way that Trump is behaving, this sort of thrusting ambition, this idea that somehow he can place Israel at the center of this new reshaped Middle East. He talks about peace that hasn't been delivered in 5,000 years, economic gains. It is all, to my ears, a madness. And it also speaks to me as well of the contempt, the actual contempt that the American administration has for Arab states, that it simply tells them, this is what you will do, and you will accept it. That train has left. It left a long time ago. And so I think you're right. This is a failed policy, and I would argue a policy of a nation that is in decline, and Trump is driving that decline. Well, look, let us leave aside the latest Trump Truth Social
Trump
scream.
mania.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what I want to do is ask you about Egypt. Now, the line that President Sisi has to walk between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, two powerful GCC states. They're at loggerheads with one another, but they are both deeply engaged in Egypt. So how is President Sisi walking that line, having to please on the one side, the Saudis on the other, the Emiratis?
With extreme difficulty. So, in order to kind of answer the question properly, we need to look at two different points here. The first point is the kind of emerging regional dynamic. So, you have a revisionist axis, which is basically the UAE, the Israelis, and the United States, that is heavily involved in the use of force to reshape the regions in a way that would fit their own narrow interests under some sort of unexpected hegemony, right? Then there is the status quo axis, mostly led by the Saudis. There are the Turks. Now the Pakistanis are involved in there, the Qataris as well, and they are trying to preserve the existing security architecture, regional dynamics, division of labor, and a concentration on what can be called stability, right? So Egypt, from my perspective, is a status quo power. It is not a power that wants to project power across its borders regionally. It has no interest in playing that role. And that would bring me to my second point, which is how does Egyptian foreign policy work? So to fully understand that, we need to understand a little bit how does the domestic dynamic in the country work. So since the revolution over 10 years ago and the coup that followed, the regime that basically came out of it has a laser focus on actual power concentration, the militarization of the state, the destruction of any social force that can actually challenge it in a way. And foreign policy is an extension of that dynamic. So it's not the traditional Egyptian foreign policy in a way that was known before that. So that's also a radical change. So the goal of Egyptian foreign policy is to maintain regional stability while ensuring continuous inflow of capital funds from the Gulf. And that was even before the crisis of 2022. Now, the needs are even more dire.
That was the financial crisis that was triggered by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it caused a massive outflow of capital.
Um, so Egypt is stuck in a way in a revisionist axis because it has closer relationships to the UAE and to the Israelis since 2013. With the Saudis, there was a lot more tension because the regime didn't deliver what it said it would, which is act as a security guarantor for the Gulf in general and the Saudis in particular. For example, involvement in Yemen was rather limited, very symbolic. Even in Syria, on the diplomatic front, there were a lot of differences. So Egypt is a status quo power stuck in a revisionist axis in a way. We also have to remember that the UAE now is by far the financial lifeline for the regime. So they need the UAE. But at the same time, the UAE is extremely hawkish. So Sisi is kind of stuck in a way where he's trying to mediate between them, trying to play all angles and to continue a policy of offering this kind of symbolic support. So in the beginning of May, I think he was visiting the UAE and he was pictured with, I think, a very small number of Egyptian fighter jets. But they used the term mafraza, which is a smaller than a squadron. So that was on purpose to show that it's a limited military presence, more symbolic than actually effective in doing anything in protecting UAE. So Egyptian foreign policy is trying to play this mediating role, but Sisi is really stuck between forces that are moving in different directions. And at some point, he's going to have to make a choice. But the question is, with whom does he
With
go?
Yeah, yeah. With whom does he go? And of course, as you've written about in our newsletter, the decline in Egypt's foreign policy is really marked, isn't it? We look at the Iran war, and Egypt, I think critics are saying, has been pretty much sidelined. I mean, would you agree with that? And if so, how and why is that happening?
Well, I can't really tell because there are kind of contradictory reports, but Egypt is clearly not playing the main mediation role there. And also, it is a function of Egyptian inward focus. The focus of the regime is actual power consolidation domestically rather than power projection or playing a larger role. Also, we have to remember that we're in a deeply polarized region where the ability to mediate is also diminishing dramatically. So Egypt is kind of stuck and it doesn't have much to offer from that perspective. It is a narrative of trying to solicit external support to continue this model of militarized state capitalism under the pretext that Egyptian security is somewhat an extension of Gulf security, just worrying that if there is instability in the country, it would spread into the Gulf. So in many ways, Egyptian foreign policy thinking remains stuck in the moment of the 2011 mass protest. And in a way, this specter of unrest is really haunting the regime on all fronts, including the foreign policy front.
So they're kind of paralyzed on that front, and as you say, the revolution in 2011 shocked the Egyptian establishment, shocked the Gulf states, and they found common cause in overthrowing Mohamed Morsi, the democratically elected president in 2013. Meanwhile, as you pointed out, Israel is very, very busy. I want to ask you now about Somaliland, and the Israelis have recognized this breakaway state, and that's causing anxiety for Egypt and for Sisi. But what is going on there, Maged?
So also to place this within a general context, the regime has had a long, deep strategic relationships with the Israelis, and it was going along quite nicely until the 7th of October. At that point, because of Israeli expansionism, aggressive behavior, especially in Gaza, it created massive tensions in the relationship. And that's also driven by the domestic factor. It's this idea that ethnically cleansing the Palestinians would destabilize the country domestically, not because Egypt will not be able to absorb the refugees, but it is against a deeply entrenched ideological narrative of nationalist chauvinism that is this Egypt first logic. So it is one of the pillars of the regime. So the fact that the Israelis were willing to follow a policy that would actually destabilize the country, that is a red line for the regime, and it would explain the reason that they were actually pushing back against that. So this tension has been increasing from 2013, but also going back to this contradictory, confused policy. Egypt still signed the largest natural gas deal in Israeli history. I think it's worth 35 billion. I think it was the beginning of the year or the end of last year. So even though it does see this kind of Israeli unbridled expansionism, aggressive colonial policy as a threat, it still continues to cooperate with it at various levels.
And Somaliland?
Now, moving to Somaliland as well should be seen as a general Egyptian fear of actually being encircled. So there is the RSF in Sudan, supported by the Emiratis, and Ethiopia, which has a long-standing dispute with Egypt over the Nile waters, and they've built the Great Renaissance Dam there. So there is historic tension, and Egypt was trying to see Somalia as a counterbalance against the Ethiopians, including sending troops to Somalia as a part of the African Union peace mission. So, placing this within the context of this increased Israeli aggressive policy, recognizing Somaliland is another step towards encircling the country in a way and weakening its position in the Red Sea. As I said, it is a status quo power stuck in a revisionist axis, and that's not a very tenable position in the medium term, not
Mhm.
even the long term.
Yeah, as you say, Egypt stuck in status quo mode, facing a revisionist access, with Israel playing the dominant role in the region, backed so heavily by the United States. You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and the Egyptian analyst, author, and commentator, Maged Mandour. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to subscribe to our reader supported daily newsletter. Sign up, and you receive the first 2 months for free. That's arabdigest.org. I want to ask you too about one of the reasons for this, inflexibility, rigidity, and that has to do with the military's grip on the economy. Now, Sisi has made repeated promises over the years to rein the generals in, to take industries away from them and put them into the private sector. Yet, if anything, the control of the generals is getting stronger on the economy. So how and why is that happening?
So we would also have to look at kind of the structural factors here. So if we look at how the regime is built, it is the first time since 1952 that an autocracy in Egypt, a dictatorship, does not have some sort of a civilian party that is actually representative of other social forces. So this is direct military rule from my view for the first time since 1952. The military always played a very important part, and it was sometimes the strongest force within the regime, but it was one force out of many. At the moment, this is not the case. So in order for Sisi, if he wants to, which I have my serious doubt that he does, if he wants to balance out the military to try to push them out, that is extremely difficult without having another organized political force that can actually balance out the military within the ruling coalition. So since this does not exist, it's very hard to dislodge the military. Second point is that from 2013, the militarization of the state has been going on relentlessly to the point where actually pushing out the military would require a massive overhaul of the legal codes, the constitution, the structure of the states. Basically, military officers have penetrated the state at all levels, and I mean at all levels, from the local to the executive to the public sector companies, you name it, they're there. So it's very hard to remove them. Second point is that when the crisis happened, and it seemed that there was a united front actually from the regime backers, including, by the way, the UAE for a while, and the IMF, there was some pressure to reform, but the regime played a game of chicken. It was basically, I will not reform, I will pay some lip service, and then we'll see who's going to blink first. And then the UAE moved in at 2024 to relieve the pressure, followed by the IMF, the World Bank, the European Union, basically bailing out the regime at the tune of 50 billion plus. So in the end, there is no real incentive for them to change the way that they are actually operating. So Sisi cannot and he will not for those reasons. Of course, there is increasing pressure due to economics because this is just not a sustainable long-term, medium-term model, but the bet remains the same. In the end, I will be able to solicit a lot of funds from the Gulf, from the financial markets, from loans, from somewhere that would keep the Ponzi scheme alive.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of like the assumption that the debt is so big, we're too big to fail.
Exactly.
But let us talk about the debt because you've written over several years on the Arab Digest newsletter about this massive debt that Egypt has. How big is it now? And really, I suppose you got the answer on what's keeping the country afloat, but what is the trajectory for the debt? Because it just seems to be getting bigger and bigger with no end in sight.
So you're absolutely correct. So the latest figures that I have is that external debt is about 161 billion, and the total debt is a bit north of 340 billion, which is as a percentage of the GDP doesn't seem to be not sustainable. But that is, of course, not the right way to look at things because if you look at it as a percentage of the government revenues, then things become very different. So the latest that I've seen is that over the past 10 months, about 75% of the government revenues have been consumed for debt servicing alone. This leaves only
75%, 75%.
75%, 75,
Wow.
75. And there
Wow.
are some months, at least in the beginning of the year, where the entire public revenue stream was actually consumed by debt servicing, all of it, 100% over 100%. Of course, this leaves you no choice but to borrow more, and you will continue to borrow more, which is also explaining why there is so much hot money in the country. I think the latest that I've read is north of 40 billion actually in the country.
Just tell us,
And
sorry to interrupt, but just tell us what hot money is so our listeners get that.
Sure. So this is basically short-term borrowing from financial markets that can be liquidated at any moment. So in 2022, what actually triggered the crisis was that around 20 billion left the country in the span of a few months. So this is very volatile and it's very susceptible to geostrategic changes, to changes in the interest rates in the Fed, etc. At the moment, they are making returns of around 20%. So that's extremely high. So this means that you have this continuous cycle of borrowing debt that has very high interest rates. So that is continuously applying pressure on the budget. So what does the regime do? The regime is not reacting in a way that you would expect, which is, for example, reforming the tax code, unifying the state budget because it's all fragmented. None of this is happening. What they're doing is that they are actually imposing already existing taxation laws, and the taxation system in the country is very regressive, which means that the poor and the middle class shoulder the burden. So he's basically taxing consumption, which means that people are getting poorer and poorer and poorer. So it is a devilish cycle. So it's not clear that there will be a collapse, but what is happening is a slow and consistent bleeding out. So resources will continue to be sucked out of the country slowly, but at a steady pace. But in the end, there are very serious questions that have to be raised about the sustainability of the debt. For
Mm,
how long can Egypt continue like this?
mm.
So without some sort of debt relief or debt restructuring, in the next few years, Egypt is going to be in a very dire straits.
And the people of
Um,
Egypt are going to be suffering. They're already suffering. As you say, the middle class is driven into poverty, the poor driven deeper and deeper into poverty. That does not seem to be of concern to Sisi as he carries on building his giga projects. But, I thought maybe there was one sort of ray of hope, which is uh, Egypt has these massive gas deposits in the East Med, the Zohr field, but apparently production is declining. However, they have these LNG facilities, and the strategy is to import gas from the Israelis, from Cyprus, get it onto the LNG route, and sell to Europe, which wants to get off the reliance on Russian gas. I mean, that would seem to me to be at least a ray of hope, a way forward. But do you think that given everything that's gone wrong under the Sisi regime, that they'll be able to capitalize on that opportunity?
well, I mean, the quantities are not sufficient to supply Europe in a way that would actually replace Russian gas. That's just not in the cards. Also, at the moment, the country is having such a rough time repaying its debt and repaying the oil companies that it simply does not have enough financial resources to import rather than to cover its own domestic consumption. So this idea of turning Egypt into this natural gas hub that will somehow miraculously save the country, that's just not in the cards. It's just not enough. So without a transformation in the way that the political system is being run, which should lead to a transformation in the way that the country's economic resources are being managed, there is no silver bullet. There is no quick fix for Egypt's severe difficulties and problems. Also, it's important to keep in mind that those mega projects have not stopped. They are continuing at a slower pace, but they are still continuing. So, any additional funds, there is no guarantee that they will not go into those fictional cities where nobody lives. So it's really not a solution that is sustainable even in the short term to provide some relief.
Mm. So we continue with a bleak picture for Egypt under Sisi. We look forward to reading your articles every month in the Arab Digest newsletter, and I look forward to having you back on the podcast very soon. But thanks,
Thank you,
thanks
Bill.
today. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
My guest today on the Arab Digest podcast was the Egyptian analyst, author, and commentator Maged Mandour. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East and North Africa. You'll have noticed we bring you the podcast with no sponsors and no advertising. It's the same for our daily newsletter. We're supported only by our subscribers. And I'll say it again, we are an independent voice. For more information on subscriptions, if you sign up, we're offering 2 months free. Head to our website, arabdigest.org. There you'll find a team of experts, contributors like Maged, covering developments in the Arab world with outstanding analysis. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.